tend to think of medieval soldiers as valiant knights in shining armor, participating in heroic battles. Cinema and literature have created an image where battles are the culmination and sole source of suffering. However, the reality was much more prosaic and cruel. A soldier's worst days were not spent on the battlefield, where glory or quick death awaited him, but in the daily struggle for survival. He suffered more from cold, hunger, and disease than from the enemy's sword. Battle wounds were only part of the picture, which included grueling marches, months of waiting, and a constant struggle against invisible dangers. In this video, we reveal the real life of a medieval soldier and the most terrible days of his service. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how an ordinary march could be more deadly for a soldier than any battle, and why his main enemy was not the sword, but the cold and hunger. The curse of waiting was perhaps one of the hardest trials for a medieval soldier. However, there were other problems that made life in the camp a living hell. One of the most serious trials was the lack of hygiene. Soldiers lived in crowded, dirty, and unsanitary conditions. They had no opportunity to wash themselves or their clothes. Water was used only for drinking and cooking, and waste was disposed of right next to the camp. This led to the spread of various diseases that could quickly knock out entire units. Food was an equally serious problem. Soldiers ate whatever they could find in the area or whatever they had with them. Their diet was extremely monotonous: crackers, salted meat, and porridge. There were almost no fresh vegetables or fruits. Soldiers often had to go hungry because food ran out or was not delivered on time. Hunger weakened the body, made it vulnerable to disease, and reduced combat effectiveness. The monotonous diet also led to scurvy. These problems were compounded by overcrowding. Soldiers lived in cramped tents with no personal space. This led to quarrels and conflicts that could escalate into serious clashes. The lack of personal space and the constant presence of other people made life in the camp unbearable. Soldiers lost their nerves, and their morale deteriorated with each passing day. The lack of information was no less difficult. Soldiers rarely knew what was happening in the war. They received orders but did not understand why they were carrying them out. This made them feel like pawns in a big game. The lack of information and constant uncertainty took their toll. The soldiers lost their motivation. They did not understand what they were fighting for, and their morale declined with each passing day. Added to these problems was the lack of leisure activities. Soldiers had no opportunity to entertain themselves or do anything other than fight. They had no books, music, or games. The only entertainment was gambling and drinking, which led to even greater problems. The lack of leisure made life in the camp monotonous and dreary. Soldiers lost interest in life, and their morale deteriorated with each passing day. Thus, life in a medieval camp was much more difficult than is commonly believed. Soldiers suffered not only from battle wounds, but also from hunger, disease, cold, and psychological pressure. These problems were far more frightening than any battle. Which of these problems do you think would have been the most difficult for you as a medieval soldier? Share your opinion in the comments. Troop movements in the Middle Ages were a real test of endurance. Soldiers marched dozens of kilometers a day, often over rough terrain, in heavy clothing and with full equipment. The roads were in terrible condition, and often there were none at all. Soldiers marched through swamps, forests, and mountains, overcoming all obstacles in their path. The lack of proper food and water made these marches even more grueling. The conditions of the march were unbearable. Rest stops were short, and the soldiers had no opportunity to rest. They slept in the open air, often without blankets, and woke up cold and damp. Constant fatigue caused the soldiers to lose strength and become vulnerable to disease. In addition to physical exhaustion, the marches had a profound psychological impact. The monotony of the journey, constant fatigue, and lack of comfort gradually broke the soldiers' will. They lost touch with their normal lives and sank into a state where their only goal was to reach the next rest stop. This deprived them of motivation and fighting spirit. One of the most difficult trials was crossing water obstacles. Rivers and lakes were a serious obstacle for the army. Soldiers had to build primitive bridges or wade across, which was especially dangerous in winter. The icy water caused numbness, and wet clothes and equipment made people vulnerable to hypothermia. In such conditions, even simply crossing a river could be more dangerous for a soldier than battle. An equally serious problem was the supply of provisions. Armies rarely had centralized supplies, and soldiers were often forced to find food for themselves. They looted villages and towns, but even that did not always help. Hunger and malnutrition made them vulnerable to disease. These problems were compounded by the lack of medical care. If a soldier was wounded or fell ill, he could not count on help. He was simply left on the road or in the nearest village, where he was forced to survive on his own. This was not only cruel, but inhumane, as a man who risked his life for the king was left to fend for himself. Thus, exhausting marches were far more dangerous than any battle. They not only deprived soldiers of their physical strength, but also caused deep psychological trauma. They were forced to fight not only the enemy, but also the cold, hunger, and disease. All these factors made him vulnerable to any danger, and even a short march could turn into a real tragedy for him. But how quickly could a person lose their strength in such conditions? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. One of the greatest dangers for medieval soldiers was the cold. They spent a lot of time outdoors, and their clothing was rarely able to protect them from rain and wind. In winter, tents did not protect them from the frost, and bonfires were often the only source of heat. The cold penetrated to the bone, causing frostbite on the extremities. Soldiers suffered from chills, unable to warm themselves. Dampness was another problem. Rain was a frequent companion on campaigns, and soldiers had no way to dry their clothes. Wet clothes became a breeding ground for various ailments. Dampness and cold led to loss of strength and made soldiers vulnerable to any danger. It was a constant battle with nature, in which man always lost. The cold was a more cruel enemy than any knight in armor. This constant struggle against the elements took a heavy toll, not only on the body but also on the spirit. The cold was relentless, an ever-present tormentor. When the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply, and a biting wind swept through the camp. The soldiers huddled together, sharing what little warmth they had, their breath turning into clouds of steam in the frosty air. The fires provided a small, flickering circle of warmth, but it was never enough to truly protect them from the cold that penetrated their bones. People took turns throwing wood on the fire, their numb fingers struggling to handle the damp wood. Sleep was a luxury, a restless and fitful state, accompanied by shivering and aching in their frozen limbs. The suffering was exacerbated by the dampness. Rain was a constant threat, turning roads into muddy swamps and camps into soggy messes. A soldier's leather boots and woolen tunics, once wet, took several days to dry, if they dried at all. The residual moisture led to a multitude of ailments. The most common illnesses were respiratory diseases, coughing, and fever, which spread through the ranks like wildfire. Trench foot was another brutal reality, as people's feet, constantly wet and cramped in tight shoes, became swollen, covered with blisters, and infected. In severe cases, the flesh turned black and rotted, leading to amputation or death. Even a simple scratch could become a serious infection in such unsanitary, damp conditions. In addition to physical suffering, the constant cold and dampness undermined morale. The spirit of soldiers, already tested by the horrors of battle, was slowly broken by simple, endless discomfort. Simply putting on a cold, wet tunic in the morning was moral torture. The constant cold and oppressive feeling of dampness created an all-pervading sense of hopelessness. It was a silent, insidious enemy that weakened the army from within. A cold, miserable soldier was a less effective soldier. His reactions slowed, his judgment clouded, and his will to fight weakened. The harsh weather proved that the enemy was not always a man with a sword, but could be a silent, merciless force of nature that was far more deadly and indiscriminate. The harsh reality was that for every soldier who fell in battle, there were many more who died from diseases and ailments caused by exposure to the elements. To add to all these woes, soldiers constantly battled skin diseases, which were widespread. The constant friction of rough fabric against wet skin led to sores and boils, which not only caused unbearable suffering, but also weakened the immune system. Dirt and infections entered the wounds, causing rot and gangrene. Soldiers were unable to wash themselves or their clothes, and their bodies became an ideal breeding ground for disease-causing bacteria. This constant discomfort robbed them of what little rest they had. This was the ugly side of medieval warfare, a slow, painful exhaustion that took lives long after the last battle cry had died away. Providing food for the army in the Middle Ages was a huge problem. Troops ate whatever they could find in the area or whatever they had with them. The diet was extremely monotonous: hardtack, salted meat, and porridge. Fresh vegetables and fruits were almost non-existent. Soldiers often had to go hungry because food ran out or was not delivered on time. Hunger weakened the body, made it vulnerable to disease, and reduced combat effectiveness. They were forced to eat whatever they could find in order to survive. Even when provisions were available, their quality left much to be desired. Malnutrition led to scurvy. Supplying provisions was one of the most difficult logistical tasks for any medieval army. Military campaigns often depended not on the valor of the soldiers, but on whether the army could find enough food. An army of thousands needed enormous amounts of food every day, and delivering it was fraught with enormous difficulties. Wagons were slow, roads were bad, and enemy troops could easily intercept convoys. As a result, soldiers often found themselves left to fend for themselves. When supplies ran out, the worst began. Hunger became a constant companion. Soldiers were forced to search for food anywhere they could find it, turning from warriors into hunter-gatherers. They ravaged nearby villages and fields, which often led to conflicts with the local population and caused hatred that could be more dangerous than any enemy. Even if they managed to find food, it was rarely nutritious. They ate roots, wild animals, and sometimes even inedible things that could cause poisoning. Constant malnutrition affected not only their physical condition, but also their morale. Hungry soldiers became irritable, easily enraged, and quarreled with each other. Discipline weakened, and the risk of desertion increased. The army, suffering from hunger, was incapable of long marches and persistent fighting. Morale melted away before our eyes, and victories became increasingly rare. Commanders understood that even the most talented military art was useless if soldiers could not hold their weapons due to exhaustion. The quality of provisions was no less important a problem. Salted beef, dried meat, and hardtack, which formed the basis of the diet, were so tough and salty that they were difficult to eat. Salt was necessary for preservation, but its excess led to dehydration. Meat was often rotten or infected, and grains were infested with beetles and worms. In such conditions, diseases caused by poor nutrition were as dangerous as enemy arrows. Scurvy, caused by a complete lack of vitamin C, was particularly terrible. The symptoms were horrific: bleeding gums, tooth loss, swollen joints, and general weakness. Scurvy could wipe out entire units, leaving soldiers helpless and unable to fight. The only cure was fresh fruit and vegetables, but these were almost impossible to obtain on campaign. Therefore, soldiers had to endure all these torments. If you lived in the Middle Ages, would you wash once a year or eat porridge with worms every day? Medieval soldiers did. We will tell you more about this later. Hygiene in a medieval camp was almost completely absent. Soldiers lived in cramped conditions and had no opportunity to wash themselves or their clothes. Water was used only for drinking and cooking. Dirty living conditions led to the spread of various diseases that could quickly knock out entire units. Constant contact with dirt and unsanitary conditions were part of their lives. This made them vulnerable to all kinds of threats. Disease was a more dangerous enemy than any weapon, as it could attack the entire army at once. A medieval military camp was a place where dirt and unsanitary conditions reigned supreme. Thousands of men, horses, and carts gathered in a small area, turning it into a swamp of mud, waste, and sewage. The lack of basic sanitary conditions made the camp a breeding ground for disease. Soldiers slept in cramped tents side by side, which created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of infections. There were no toilets, and people relieved themselves wherever they could, contaminating the water and soil. This in turn led to intestinal infections that decimated the army faster than any enemy. The soldiers' clothing and footwear were also a source of problems. They wore the same clothes for weeks, sometimes months, without being able to wash them. Dirt, sweat, and moisture accumulated in the fabric, creating a favorable environment for lice and fleas to breed. These parasites were not just unpleasant, they carried dangerous diseases such as typhus. Typhus was a real scourge of medieval armies. Its symptoms, high fever, headache, rash, and delirium, quickly weakened soldiers and often led to death. Entire armies could be completely wiped out by a typhus epidemic, which was a much more terrifying threat than any battle. The inability to wash had other consequences as well. Wounds sustained in battle often became infected due to the dirt that got into them. Even a small cut could lead to a fatal infection. Surgical operations, if they were performed at all, were carried out in appalling conditions without sterile instruments or disinfection. After surgery, the wound was often treated with dirty rags or not treated at all, which almost guaranteed that it would become infected. As a result, many soldiers died not from the severity of their wounds, but from subsequent infection. Water was another problem. It was taken from rivers and streams that flowed through the camp. These same bodies of water were used for washing and as a place to dispose of waste. Unsurprisingly, the water was contaminated and contained many disease-causing bacteria. Consuming such water caused dysentery and other intestinal diseases, which dehydrated the body and sapped the soldier's strength. These diseases were widespread and constantly weakened the army. In addition to obvious threats, constant unsanitary conditions led to invisible but no less devastating consequences. Lack of cleanliness led to skin diseases, scabies, and ulcers, which not only caused unbearable suffering, but also weakened the immune system. In such conditions, even a minor illness, such as a cold, could prove fatal. Dirt was everywhere on clothes, hands, faces, and every contact with it was a risk. Soldiers were forced to live in constant filth, which made their bodies and spirits vulnerable. Thus, even if a soldier managed to survive battle, hunger, and cold, he was still in mortal danger due to the constant threat of infection. The lack of hygiene was not just an inconvenience, but a factor that determined survival or death in war. It was an invisible battle where microbes and bacteria were the enemy, and in this battle, man most often lost. Sleep was another challenge for medieval soldiers. They slept in the open air, on the ground, without pillows or blankets. The cold and damp penetrated their clothes, preventing them from falling asleep. Sleep was short and shallow. They were constantly awakened by the cold or noise. The lack of normal sleep led to moral and physical exhaustion. Sleep, which in peacetime is a natural process of restoring strength, in the conditions of a medieval military campaign, turned into another form of torture. Soldiers, exhausted after long days of marching and grueling training, dreamed only of sleep, but their bodies and minds were constantly on edge. The lack of proper shelter meant that they slept directly on the cold, damp ground, curled up in a ball to keep warm. Every bump and stone under their bodies felt like sharp needles, preventing them from relaxing. The cold was the main enemy of sleep. When the temperature dropped, especially at night, the frosty air penetrated their thin clothes and blankets, if they had any. The soldiers were constantly waking up from chills, their muscles cramping. They often had to get up and walk around the campfire to keep warm. Constant interruptions to their sleep prevented their bodies from recovering, and by morning they felt even more exhausted than in the evening. The lack of sleep accumulated, turning into chronic exhaustion. In addition to the cold, sleep was shallow due to the constant danger. The camp was always on edge. Any rustle, a sentry's cry, or even the sound of an animal passing by could wake the entire camp. Subconsciously, the soldiers were always on guard, ready to grab their weapons at any moment. This constant anxiety prevented the brain from fully relaxing. This led to insomnia, nightmares, and ultimately nervous exhaustion. Many soldiers suffered from hallucinations, seeing enemies in the darkness, which further exacerbated their suffering. The lack of quality sleep and constant tension had serious consequences for combat effectiveness. A tired and sleep-deprived soldier was sluggish, his reactions were slow, and his coordination was impaired. He couldn't think clearly or make quick decisions in battle, and even simple tasks such as assembling a bow or sharpening a sword became difficult. Morale also declined. Lack of sleep made people irritable, pessimistic, and indifferent to their own lives. Chronic exhaustion made them vulnerable to all kinds of diseases, as their immune systems were weakened. Thus, sleep, which should have been a salvation, became another ordeal that broke the soldier's will, making him weak and vulnerable. The endurance that was so valued in battle was undermined every night, and the mind slowly but surely went mad from constant sleep deprivation and cold. Sleep deprivation was, of course, a difficult ordeal, but do you know what was even harder? The soldier's armor. We'll tell you more about that later. Don't switch videos. The armor that was supposed to protect soldiers often became the cause of their suffering. It was incredibly heavy and uncomfortable, especially when worn for long hours. The iron and steel from which the armor was made became icy in the cold season. This caused numbness and stiffness. The weight of the armor caused soldiers to lose strength and become unable to move. In hot weather, the armor turned into real ovens, with temperatures inside reaching unbearable levels. Soldiers sweated and moisture accumulated inside, causing skin irritation. Armor was a symbol of strength, but in practice it was a real torture. Armor, no matter how beautiful and intimidating it looked from the outside, was actually a source of constant torment for its owner. The average knight's armor weighed between 25 and 40 kilograms, and sometimes even more. This weight was unevenly distributed, putting enormous strain on the shoulders, back, and legs. It took years of training and incredible endurance to carry such a load. Even the strongest and most experienced warriors could not wear armor all day without a break. In addition to its weight, the armor was incredibly uncomfortable. It restricted movement, preventing the wearer from bending, turning, or even sitting down normally. Every movement required tremendous effort. Long marches in full armor were practically impossible, so armor was only worn before battle. But even for short periods of time, it became a real prison. The joints of the armor could pinch the skin, and the sharp edges could rub and cause wounds. The constant creaking and clanging of metal was annoying and made it hard to focus. In cold weather, metal armor became icy. The cold penetrated the undergarments, thick cloth or leather jackets, and chilled the soldiers to the bone. Limbs quickly froze, muscles stiffened, making movements slow and awkward. Even if a soldier could warm himself by a fire, the armor remained cold for a long time. This constant hypothermia made them vulnerable to disease, and frostbite was common. Frozen hands and feet lost sensitivity, and warriors could not hold their weapons firmly. In hot weather, armor became even more dangerous. The metal quickly heated up in the sun, turning into a real furnace. The temperature inside the armor rose to unbearable levels, and air circulation was practically zero. In these conditions, soldiers quickly lost strength due to heat stroke and dehydration. Sweat poured down their bodies, accumulating inside the armor and causing irritation, rashes, and boils. Salty sweat corroded the skin, and the dirt that accumulated inside led to infections. Many soldiers fainted from overheating before the battle even began. Even the slightest damage to armor could have fatal consequences. If the metal was dented or cracked, it could pinch a limb, leaving the soldier helpless. In the heat of battle, no one could help him. This was especially dangerous in large-scale battles, where a fallen warrior would immediately find himself under the feet of his comrades and enemies. The chances of surviving in such a situation were minimal. On top of everything else, armor was extremely expensive. Many infantrymen did not even have a full set, limiting themselves to just a helmet or chainmail. This made them vulnerable, but it also spared them some of the torment associated with wearing heavy armor. However, for those who were lucky enough to have full armor, it became not only protection, but also a symbol of their status, albeit at the cost of enormous physical and mental suffering. Wearing armor was a kind of ritual that required not only strength, but also incredible fortitude to endure all the trials it brought. Thus, armor, designed to save lives, often became the cause of death. It was a symbol of power and strength, but wearing it was a real torture that required not only physical, but also incredible psychological endurance. Constant marching, heavy armor, lack of sleep and food all led to chronic fatigue. Soldiers lost concentration and their reactions slowed, making them vulnerable on the battlefield. Fatigue was a more dangerous enemy than any weapon, as it deprived soldiers of their fighting ability. Chronic fatigue was invisible, but the most dangerous enemy of the medieval soldier. It slowly but surely sapped his strength, turning a strong and resilient warrior into an exhausted man who could barely stand on his feet. Every day was filled with exhausting labor. Long marches, often across rough terrain, under the scorching sun or pouring rain, carrying heavy packs and weapons on their shoulders, required incredible physical effort. Journeys could last for weeks, and every step was a test. When the army arrived at its destination, there was no rest. It was necessary to set up camp, dig trenches, build fortifications, and stand night watch. Even simple tasks such as sharpening a sword or repairing equipment became torture for the weary body. The inability to fully recover turned fatigue into a chronic condition. Every muscle ached, joints ached, and legs swelled. But the next day it all started again, and the cycle repeated itself over and over. The effects of exhaustion were felt not only physically, but also psychologically. Constant fatigue dulled the mind. People lost their ability to concentrate, became distracted, and were unable to make quick and informed decisions. On the battlefield, this meant certain death. A tired soldier did not notice the approaching enemy, did not have time to dodge or parry a blow. His movements became slow and clumsy, and his reactions were delayed. Even the most skilled warriors, exhausted by fatigue, became vulnerable to inexperienced opponents. Overwork also affected morale. When the body and mind are at their limit, it is difficult for a person to remain optimistic and determined to win. Soldiers became irritable, easily enraged, and conflicted with each other. This destroyed the unity of the unit, which was so important for survival. Many simply lost their motivation to fight and were ready to surrender at the first opportunity. In such an army, it was difficult to maintain discipline, and it could fall apart even without direct confrontation with the enemy. On top of everything else, exhaustion made the soldiers more susceptible to disease. Their weakened bodies couldn't fight off infections, and a simple cold could turn into deadly pneumonia. The combination of hunger, cold, and fatigue created ideal conditions for epidemics that could wipe out half the army before it even saw the enemy. Commanders who did not care about the condition of their men condemned them to certain death. They could have had a brilliant battle plan, but if their troops were too exhausted to carry it out, victory remained an unattainable dream. This constant struggle with one's own body and spirit was part of every soldier's life. Fatigue was his constant companion, and rest was only a brief respite between torments. It was a constant battle in which victory was impossible. Only defeat could be delayed. Thus, fatigue and exhaustion were a more insidious and dangerous enemy than any knight or band of archers. They undermined the army's combat effectiveness from within, making it weak and ineffective. It was a constant battle with one's own body in which soldiers usually lost, even if they survived the battle. Even after victory, they did not get proper rest, and the cycle of suffering began again. Even after victory, another ordeal awaited them: the journey home. They traveled the same roads they had taken to war, but now they were even more tired and exhausted. Many of them were wounded, which made the journey even more painful. The road home was no less dangerous than the war itself. The long and exhausting journey home was the final test for medieval soldiers, and it was often as harsh as the war itself. The fatigue that had built up over months of deprivation and fighting reached its peak. The joy of victory quickly gave way to chronic exhaustion that permeated every bone. These soldiers, once full of strength, were now mere shadows of their former selves, their bodies worn out and their spirits broken. The roads they were returning on no longer seemed unfamiliar, but now they were even more hostile. Broken and washed away by rain, they turned into swamps where feet and wagon wheels got stuck. Every mile of the journey was pure torture. The wounded soldiers, carried on stretchers or in carts, suffered with every jolt and shake, their wounds bleeding and unable to heal. Many died on the road from sepsis, gangrene, or simple exhaustion, never making it home. Even without wounds, the road was full of dangers. Deserters and bandits left behind after the battle could attack the weakened troops. The local population, whose villages had been looted during the campaign, could harbor resentment and attack from ambushes. Hunger and disease continued to plague the soldiers. The remaining food supplies were running out, and they often had to rely on what they could find along the way. But now, with the country ravaged by war, there was even less food than at the beginning of the campaign. Many soldiers returned home to find that their lives had changed forever. Some were maimed and unable to return to their former jobs. Others suffered from psychological trauma that today would be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares haunted them, and the noise of crowds or the clang of metal could trigger panic attacks. Society was not prepared for this, and these people were often left alone with their grief. They received no help and were forced to cope with their problems on their own. The journey home was not only a physical ordeal, but also a psychological one. They were returning to a world that no longer seemed the same as the one they had left behind. They had seen death and suffering that civilians could never understand. It was a journey not only to their native village, but also to themselves, to the people they once were. Many never found it, remaining forever prisoners of the horrors of war. Loneliness and alienation became their constant companions. Veterans who were unable to work were often considered vagrants and outcasts. They were forgotten. Their deeds were of no use to anyone. Unlike the noble knights who received honors and new lands, ordinary soldiers returned to nowhere. All that awaited them was poverty and alms from monasteries or on the roads. It was a bitter and cruel end to their service, which showed the true price of their bravery. In the end, for a medieval soldier, war did not end with the last battle. It continued every step of the way home, in every nightmare, in every scar. It was a harsh reminder that for the common man, war was not a romantic adventure, but a merciless machine that ground lives into dust and then discarded those it no longer needed. For those who survived, the last days of service were a real test. They were tired, exhausted, and often sick. Many of them had no money and had to wander around begging for alms. They were forgotten. Their deeds were of no use to anyone. It was a bitter and cruel end to their service. After the campaign ended, whether in victory or defeat, the surviving soldiers faced perhaps the most brutal phase of their lives. They returned home not as heroes, but as a burden on society. Their deeds were quickly forgotten, and their needs were ignored. Exhausted and often maimed, these people were left to fend for themselves. Many of them had no means of support and no way to return to their former lives, as their bodies and minds had been broken by war. Wounded and sick soldiers were a tragedy in themselves. In the Middle Ages, there was no system of care for veterans. Medical care was primitive, and hospitals were more like shelters for the poor. A soldier who suffered a serious wound was likely to become disabled. Without arms, legs, blind, or maimed, he could not return to the battlefield and fight, which meant he was useless to his master. He was simply released and left to fend for himself. Maimed veterans were forced to wander, beg for alms, or seek shelter in monasteries just to survive. Even those who returned unharmed faced difficulties. They were too old and too exhausted to engage in heavy physical labor, and they had no other skills. Military service did not provide a profession. Soldiers were merely pawns in a game played by kings, and when the game was over, they were discarded like useless trash. The rural communities to which they returned were often unable to feed another person, let alone someone who was unable to work in the fields. Many of them suffered from psychological trauma, sleepless nights, nightmares about battles and the screams of the dying, constant anxiety. All this made them outcasts. They were different from others. Their experiences were too horrific for peaceful people. They were shunned, considered crazy or dangerous. This led to even greater isolation and a sense of hopelessness. The war left them with not only physical scars, but also deep emotional scars that never healed. In addition to physical and psychological suffering, veterans faced a complete lack of social support. They returned to a society that did not understand their experiences and did not want to know about them. Peasants and artisans lived their lives, and war was something distant to them, something they only heard about in stories. Soldiers' attempts to talk about the horrors they had experienced were often met with rejection or fear. This reinforced their feelings of loneliness and alienation. While knights and noble warriors could count on the mercy of their lord, who rewarded them with land or titles, a simple foot soldier received nothing but a farewell. His contribution to victory was forgotten, as if he had never existed. He had no place in the system. He was too tired to return to the battlefield and too broken to return to peaceful life. For him, the war never ended. It continued in his thoughts, in his nightmares, and in his scarred body. Thus, the last days of a medieval soldier were a bitter and cruel end to his service. He gave his strength, health, and years of his life for the good of his lord, but in return received only oblivion and poverty. History rarely preserved their names, their deeds were forgotten, and their suffering was of no interest to anyone. It was a harsh reminder that for the common man, war is not a romantic adventure, but a merciless machine that grinds lives into dust and then discards those it no longer needs. We learned that the life of a medieval soldier was much more difficult and cruel than is commonly believed. His main enemies were not people, but hunger, cold, and disease. He suffered more from deprivation than from battle wounds. We saw that armor and weapons were only part of his equipment, and his real weapon was his endurance. We learned how the cold and damp penetrated his bones, how hunger turned him from a warrior into a hunter for food, and how unsanitary conditions in the camp made him vulnerable to epidemics. We saw how his armor, a symbol of his strength, became a real torture, and how lack of sleep and chronic fatigue undermined his spirit and body. Finally, we learned that even after victory, a difficult journey home in oblivion awaited him. We told you about the 10 most terrible days in the life of a soldier, but what else interests you about the history of medieval people? Write about it in the comments. If you liked the video and want to learn more about how people lived in the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel